is the Danger Close Podcast, Beyond the Books with me, Jack Carr. Welcome to the Danger Close Podcast, an Ironclad original presented by Sig Sauer. So my guest today is a dear friend, Fred Burton. Fred Burton was with the Diplomatic Security Service of the State Department, specializing in counterterrorism for a career that spanned from the mid-'80s up until really 2001. He's the author of a book I go back to time and time again as I'm researching characters for my novels, trying to get inside the head of terrorists, particularly during this time frame in the mid-'80s with Hezbollah. But Beirut Rules, Ghost is another book of his that goes through his time in the Diplomatic Security Service, Chasing Shadows, and Under Fire about Benghazi. So can't recommend these books enough. Had a great time talking to Fred, and without further ado, Fred Burton. Fred Burton is my guest today. I knew about Fred well before we were friends, and I go to his books often for research. Even if I lived through an event, remember it, have researched it in the past, I always come back to these books because they're so well written, first off, and you had a hand in so many of these different events that were very impactful to me during a very important time in my life. But how did this all start for you? So your official title was a State Department Diplomatic Security Services counterterrorism chief eventually, or a agent, or how does that? What was the official title?
Sure, I'll give you the thumbnail sketch of my career,
Yes.
Jack. When I graduated from basic agent training, I was assigned to what at that time was called the counterterrorism branch. And I looked around the room. You know how it is when you're graduating from these classes, and there was another agent that was also assigned there. And I kind of eyeballed him and he eyeballed me, and we're kind of looking at each other, and we had no idea what it was. And we show up, and lo and behold, there's three of us literally for the world within the State Department's newly formed Diplomatic Security Service. So,
And what year is this?
This is 1985.
1985.
Yeah. And, there's a long history, Jack, that a lot of folks don't know that I try to come back to in my stories. Meaning, if you look at the State Department's history of security and intelligence, it actually goes back to 1916 when it was formed as the first Bureau of Secret Intelligence. And there's really like a cool badge that exists to that. So, after the U.S. Embassy bombings in Beirut in 83 and 84, and also the U.S. Embassy bombing in Kuwait, there was a big study put together by Admiral Bobby Ray Inman, who's just a hero, legendary figure with the U.S. Navy. He was at the CIA and he was at NSA, and he studies the vulnerabilities to all of these State Department disasters that have occurred from the 60s to the 70s to the 80s. And he puts together this commission that says we really need to hire a bunch of State Department agents. So I was one of those first agents that were hired, and we were called Inman Hires. And Admiral Inman remains a mentor of mine and was kind enough to write a couple book jacket testimonials for me on my books. And he teaches here at the University of Texas in Austin, where I'm based at. So as a result of Admiral Inman's work, the State Department beefs up all of its security around the globe. And I was one of those first agents assigned to the counterterrorism branch.
Wow, but your story goes back a little farther than that. And I highly recommend people pick up the Chasing Shadows right here. But you're in all these books, we'll talk about them all. We might have to do a different podcast for each one of these books, and then about your future one that I hope you're working on now. But when you were a kid, you were 16, 15,
16.
A neighbor of yours was murdered.
Right.
In your neighborhood. And who was he? And did that start you down that path, or were you already on a path to some sort of service or some sort of government service Were you already on that path and this just solidified it, or was this a seminal event in your childhood?
Well, Jack, much like you and I have chatted in the past, I don't know how much was fate or destiny, but here as a young kid growing up in the outskirts of Washington D.C. in Bethesda, Chevy Chase, Maryland, we had a killing in our neighborhood, and these things just didn't happen. Now, this is before the internet, and of course, this is covered on the local radio, and you have. At that time, you had the Washington Post that was delivered in the morning, and we actually had an evening newspaper called the Washington Star. And so we have this murder in the neighborhood of what turned out to be an Israeli diplomat. And he actually was the military attaché. He was a hero of the state of Israel. He was one of the original founders of the Israeli Air Force in 1948. His name was Joe Alon. And he was murdered. And he pulled in late at night from an embassy party, stepped out of his car. A gunman stepped out of the bushes and fired several rounds into him and hit the car. His wife had actually gone inside. And so that was something that always stuck with me. So, as soon as I turned 17, Jack, I started volunteering at the Bethesda Chevy Chase Rescue Squad, which I talk about in my first book, Ghost. The rescue squad actually came and picked up Colonel Alon that night. And so I really got the bug of public safety through volunteering at the rescue squad. And then I became a local police officer with Montgomery County, Maryland, where the murder actually occurred before I became a special agent with the State Department. So, my life kind of evolved around this murder that happened in the neighborhood. And so after I did my first book, Ghost, I went back to this story because I always thought it was a story that needed to be told.
Yeah. And did you go to college in there at some point, or you went right into
Yeah,
after high school?
No, I went, to the University of Maryland and graduated with a degree in criminal justice and psychology. And so that was my path to kind of, get me in started. But, for me, Jack, the rescue squad kind of lit the fuse in my eyes to do something in public service. And, I remain a life member there, and I go back for talks and book signings whenever I can. So there was a whole group of us at that time that went into public safety. Many of us either went to fire and rescue, and a good number of us went to either local, state, or federal police, and we kind of went from there. We had a lot of U.S. Park Police officers that came out of the rescue squad that flew Eagle One, their helicopter. That is very famous around the DC area for river rescues, and it's also used for presidential escorts and so forth.
That's amazing. How many years did you do on that police force there?
I did 3.
Okay.
And I had a wise old sergeant, Jack, that was a great guy. He had been a SWAT team commander, and he said, "Fred, do you really want to be doing this when you're 50? And I can't look further than, next week at that age." And he said, you really need to think about looking at federal law enforcement. And the backstory there is, as a young cop, I certainly couldn't afford much. And I had an apartment that I think I got a discount for parking my cruiser in the parking lot, back in those days.
And what year is this? Is it early 80s right here?
Early 80s. And so I used to drive by this location. Well, I used to drive by where Colonel Alon was murdered pretty much every night after getting off of my evening shift or midnight shift, and just think about, how did the bad guys get away from killing this guy? I must have driven down that street, Jack, I don't know, 500 times, and just think about the case. And
Did you go into those files? Was there files at that police department that you read, or an
not
investigation that you
really.
read?
In those days, this is pre-incident, pre-internet days. The file would have been in the homicide division or in the cold case squad, and I was so far down the rungs as just a beat cop that I would never have been able to get access to them anyways. And probably some crusty old detective would have booted me out of the room if I had asked. But so that really kind of stuck with me forever. And so when I was fortunate enough to land in the counterterrorism division with the State Department, one of the first things I did was pulled that case file to see what we had on it at the time. And this would have been 1986. And in those days, we kept our case files, it was a hodgepodge of open source newspaper clippings, a police report. There might have been an FBI report in there. I don't remember anything from the CIA being stuck in the file. There might have been a picture of Colonel Alon. And, I would just kind of study it. And I said, this case has never been solved. We really need to reopen it. And I had a crusty old boss at the time who turned out to be a wonderful mentor of mine. And he kind of looked at me and said, well, if you want to look at it, you can do it on your own time or as time permits, because, Jack, we had hijackings and kidnappings and terrorist attacks all around the globe. So there wasn't a lot of time, even though this was 1986, to look at a case that happened in the 70s. So that was just the nature of the business during those days.
So you had to wait till you got a little more seniority where you could then go and open that file and not have somebody tell you to do it on your own time. But you waited a few years, right, until you really dove back into it. Is that right?
I did. It was always on my desk. On my desk was an old wooden desk, and I had a thumbtack picture of Carlos the Jackal to my left that was just like always there staring at me. And then on my desk, I had the Beirut embassy bombings. I had the kidnappings of all the American hostages in Lebanon, specifically William Buckley, the CIA station chief. And then I had the Colonel Alon file on my desk as well. And I would dabble with it from time to time. I remember once sending a cable off. In those days, you had to type them on a IBM Selectric. And wow. You had to use an OCR font. I remember that. And, I'm there typing like this, fingers, and typing up a cable and sending it to the U.S. Embassy in Tel Aviv, to our regional security officer at the time, saying, hey, I've reopened this case. I'd love to know what you might have in your files. Is there any way you can visit with the Israeli Shin Bet, their domestic security service, and ask them what they might have on this? And I remember I got nowhere. It was just one of these cases that had just slipped through the cracks.
Interesting. So I'm going to take it back a tiny bit here. So you apply for specifically the DSS portion of State Department.
And let me mention something. I left out a key part there, Jack, that I'm glad you did that. You're a good interrogator.
I've been on the receiving end of a couple.
The Secretary of State at the time was George Shultz, and he lived in Bethesda, Maryland. So on my way home, I knew that there were these agents that protected the Secretary of the State, but they weren't Secret Service. So who the hell were they? So I wasn't the sharpest knife in the drawer, but I was able to piece together that these were actually State Department special agents. And so I said, man, that sounds like a very cool job. Wonder what these guys and gals usually do. So that kind of led me on my hunt to try to apply for the State Department. And I think, like anything else, Jack, timing in this world is everything. And I applied at a time when the organization was just expanding. I think when I first joined, we might have had 250 agents for the entire world.
Wow.
And then we greatly increased that first couple of years after the Inman Commission study.
Wow. That's amazing. So you apply, and back then you couldn't just go to your computer and Google it and find out. You had to take initiative. You had to figure this out. So where did you go? Did you go walk down to the the State Department and ask them, hey, who are these guys? How do you apply? Like, how would you find out back in those days, like mid 80s, how to apply for a federal? You find a number and you call the State Department.
You find a number and you call and you say, hey, I'd like to know how do I go about applying for a job with the State Department? In those days, you had personnel that would help you and mail you like a vacancy announcement. And I remember, filling out all the forms and listing all my, my references like we all do. We list our buddies that we know are not going to come in and say, hey, Fred's a good guy. You want to make sure you've got that box checked. So I listed all my friends from the rescue squad and the police department. And then I remember it was kind of a funny story, Jack. In those days, you really didn't know much about the State Department. Now since Benghazi and other disasters, a lot more people know about these jobs. So I remember getting a notice to report for a oral interview, and it really didn't tell you where to, what to expect. And I went down to a office on Wisconsin Avenue in Georgetown. For those of you that will be watching this or listening to this in the DC area, it was in some obscure office in DC down near Georgetown. And I remember walking in, and I had the best suit I had at the time as a cop, as you know. I think I might have had, yeah, exactly. I might have had to gone out and buy one to make sure that I looked presentable. And I walked in, and there were three people that would interview you. And I subsequently found out that two of the three were agents, and maybe one was an active duty, and maybe one had been retired. I'm not really sure now. And the other was a foreign service officer. And I remember them asking me just very unusual questions that I didn't expect, such as, Fred, what's the last book that you read? Now, fortunately, that was one thing that I did do a lot of. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, is this kind of a trick question? Do I have to have like James Bond, or what do I need to mention here? And the first thing that came to mind was Chesapeake by James Michener. And Michener had always been a writer that I'd always read. And I remember saying that. And then I remember the agents kind of looking at me. And then the foreign service officer said, well, tell me a little bit about that book. Nice. Just to try to make sure that I actually had read it.
Right. Oh, that's fantastic.
So, which I always thought was a good question.
No, that's a great question. I love that one because I can talk about books all day long. So I like getting that one. And then did you go through a process before you went to training? Like, was there a poly involved back then or anything like that?
No, there was no polygraph in those days whatsoever. So they asked me a series of questions. And I remember, one of the questions was a deadly force scenario. Okay, Fred, I know you don't know how to do protection, but let's say you're on a protection detail and you're protecting a British royal that comes to the United States. And all of a sudden, a man with a gun starts charging you. What would you do? And, of course, you're trying to dissect that in your mind, saying, okay, I'm a cop now. What would I do? Well, you want to cover and evacuate the protectee. And then you're going to try to neutralize the threat. And then at that point, they're asking you questions. Well, like, how would you go about neutralizing the threat? And the whole thing is they're trying to stair step you through. Would you be willing to use deadly force if need be to protect life in that kind of scenario?
Yeah.
And so that's what they're trying to get to as a course of that. And then, Jack, for some strange reason, I must have passed all the questions. And they started running the background investigation. I remember there was, I'm sure he's deceased by now, but there was an old-time FBI agent, retired FBI agent, that actually did my background investigation. And because all my friends would say, hey, Fred, there was this guy coming around asking questions about you. And I said, well, what'd you say? You didn't say anything bad, did you? And they said, oh, no, of course not. We took care of you. Of course, you never really know, right?
Right, you never know.
And then I remember getting a letter of being hired. And it was like, wow. And I seem to recall my starting pay might have been like $21,000, or
Big
it was
time.
something along that line. It wasn't a lot of money
Yeah,
in
I
that
mean,
time period, but
it's not why you
hell,
do it. Yeah.
I was going to be a federal agent.
That's
I didn't care
amazing.
what they were going to pay me.
Right. And did you go Did you
So
guys go to the federal law enforcement training facility in Georgia? Was that around back then?
yes, yes. I'm not that old, Jack.
I don't know when
It
it
was
started. I
built.
don't know that.
Yeah, it was built then, but you started off in Washington, D.C. at the State Department. And I remember walking in, we had a class of 48 agents.
Okay.
And that was a large group of agents. And everybody goes around and introduces themselves. And I remember standing up and saying, hi, I'm Fred Burton. I was a police officer with Montgomery County, Maryland, before I was fortunate enough to get this job. And then going around the room, just listening and being, oh my gosh, there was agents from DEA that were transferring over. There were cops from all around the country that were coming in. There were only 2 agents in my class that actually were hired right out of college with practically no law enforcement experience. There was a lot of former military, Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force, all the branches of service, or they had served. And then our first training location was at Summit Point, West Virginia, at the Bill Scott Raceway.
That's what I was going to say. I know that. I've been there. I was like, I know
sure
that
you
town.
have.
It's been a long time. I think I went there in '99 and did the driving training out there.
Yeah,
BSR.
And that it was, well, first off, it was cold.
Okay.
And I mean, it is cold in West Virginia in the wintertime when we went through basic agent training, and we did all the crash and bang driving courses there, which were a lot of fun, which I'm sure you've been
so
through.
Great.
And then we had, in those days, I know you're a gun guy. So we had 3 primary weapons. We had the Smith & Wesson 357 Model 19.
Okay.
Which is still
Classic.
one of my favorite guns of all time.
Oh, yeah.
And then we had the Uzi.
Nice.
And then we had the shorty shotguns.
Okay.
Which were the Remington 870s that had been cut down.
Mm-hmm.
So when you were in a follow car, you could just pull them up,
Okay.
And we were at the outdoor. Of course, there's no indoor range in that time period. I don't know when you went through if they had one, but
not there at that time.
Yeah, we were shooting in the outdoor ranges in the wintertime, standing in snow, just freezing our rear ends off, with a unbelievable firearms instructor, Jack, who had been a legend in our service. He was a retired Marine sniper, and he had trained all the agents, from the late 60s on up into the 70s into the 80s. And he was, as you know, in this business, one of these no BS guys.
Oh yeah. Especially that generation, guys coming out of Vietnam probably. And
oh yeah.
Especially as a Marine sniper, that's no joke.
Yeah. And real legend in our business. He was one of the agents that went out on all of our hot spots around the globe. I subsequently found out that he was actually involved in the first and second U.S. Embassy bombing investigations in Beirut, just because of, he was a gunslinger, know, and in those days, we had that generation of agent, Jack, that had come out of Vietnam, and, most had served in the military. In fact, several had, been at the U.S. Embassy in Saigon when it had been overran in '68, and some had served in Islamabad in '79 when we had the embassy facility seizure there and the embassy set on fire, but Benghazi style. And then, of course, One of our agents had actually been a hostage in Tehran during that embassy facility seizure for 444 days.
No kidding. And he was an
Yeah,
instructor at that point?
No.
When you met him? Or he was an agent?
When I met him, he might have been responsible for the oversight of the anti-terrorism assistance program at the time, which also came out of that 1986 timeframe.
Okay.
The global assistance program. And in fact, he was very helpful to Sam and I put together a Benghazi story.
Yeah.
And his picture is in our Benghazi book. Just talking us through that time period.
Yeah.
There was just so much disaster with the State Department in the 60s and the 70s, and predominantly in the 70s was very bad decade for the State Department.
Yeah, well, we're learning, always learning. So then you go finish BSR, and then you go down to Georgia and go through that program, which is a few months long.
We went from Bill Scott Raceway in West Virginia to the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, FLETC, okay, for the Criminal Investigator Training Program, the 1811 series training program.
Okay.
Which was a good course. I enjoyed it immensely. Then after, it was 8 weeks. And then we come back to Washington, where we did all the specialized training, such as the mock motorcades, the dummy protective details, the exercises through the streets of Washington, where we would move protectees and learn how to put together a motorcade. And then we also had, specialized briefings like foreign counterintelligence, which obviously the Cold War is, roaring in those days. Then we had U.S. passport and visa fraud special investigations. How do you conduct those? And then there was really no training to do what I had done. So when I was assigned to my unit, then I started looking around to see where else I could go to learn how to investigate, for example, bombings. So once I got to our group, I went at that point to the FBI bombing crime scene school down at Quantico, which was a very cool school. I would highly recommend it. I'm sure a lot of your listeners have been there. It's a great school. The practical exercise at the time was a car bomb, and then you investigate how the bomb occurred. Wow. And then I went to a DOD bombing school at Indian Head, Maryland.
Okay.
I remember going through that one.
Yeah.
Which was kind of cool because we actually made IEDs.
Yep.
Which was kind of nerve-wracking.
That's fantastic. And when you got to this unit, did you expect to be doing investigations, or did you expect to be walking on a detail for foreign heads of state or that sort of thing? What did you think you were stepping into?
I had no idea. And I literally had no idea what I was stepping into. I said, wow, counterterrorism branch, man, this must be like the cutting edge. And I get there to see, like, I'm one of three.
Wow.
And our job, we were really kind of making it up at the time. So my boss at the time, Steve Gleason, who's a wonderful mentor, I'm still in touch with Steve today. He had investigated the first embassy bombings and had investigated the first hostage taking. So he kind of looked at me and said, "Hey, you're the young guy in here now. I want you to handle the sandbox, which was the Middle East."
Mm-hmm.
And he said, "You've got all the hostages and you've got all the terrorist attacks that take place there." And, I didn't want to look at him and say, "Steve, I really don't know what the hell I'm doing." But I didn't really know what I was doing.
Yeah.
and so he kind of held my hand and, went out with me on the first hostage debriefing that we had. And then the second one, he said, "You've learned now. I want you to handle this. I'll be there just watching."
No kidding. And
which is kind of nervous.
What was that first
right?
debriefing? Is that one when a hostage is released and now you're going
Correct.
to get
when
intel,
hostage,
debrief them?
Right. When a hostage was debriefed. And so what I did to study up on that, Jack, is I went back, the whole history of hostage debriefing really originated out of the POWs at the Hanoi Hilton in Vietnam. And we had case files in our office there surrounding those debriefings that were a hodgepodge of State Department, DOD, CIA kind of people that did debriefings. And then we had the U.S. Embassy Tehran hostage debriefing files in our office. And I went through them with a fine-tooth comb to kind of look at the kind of line of questioning that went on during that time period. And then what we would do as we went to debrief the hostage would kind of feed off each other and ask a series of questions surrounding, help walk me through what happened that first day. What do you remember about your initial abduction? Do you remember being under surveillance before? If so, how? And then we would get very tactical in the course of these debriefings at times, depending upon the health and mental capacity of the hostage that we were debriefing. Now, of course, from a special ops perspective, we would ask those kinds of requirements too, such as, do you remember your holding cell? What did it look like? Which ways did the doors swing open? How were the windows configured? What kind of weapons did the guards have that were guarding you? And how did they secure you? And so we went through a very detailed kind of list of requirements that we would solicit from the intelligence community before we went out to debrief the actual hostage.
Right. And so at this point, you are 7-8 years past the Iranian revolution and the Iranian hostage crisis. You're 3, 4, 5, getting to 5 years past the Marine barracks bombing in Beirut, past the embassy annex bombing there. And then do you remember the first, what was the first terrorist incident that you investigated or were involved with that happened while you were in that seat during that first year or two on the job?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I know I reconstructed them for my first book, Ghost. A couple things, leap to mind, Jack, was in 1987, we had an individual that, this is a domestic threat investigation. We had, let me back up. 1986, the two cases that I vividly recall working on, one involved the shooting of a State Department officer in Sana'a, Yemen. And then in 86, we had the shooting of another State Department officer in Khartoum, Sudan. Both were carried out by Libyan hit teams. Those were two of my first cases. And I remember the old identikit, which was kind of like an Etch-a-Sketch that you would piece together with suspect identification. Both of the victims lived and were able to help with identification of suspects. And we put together some drawings, and we were able to cobble together that, the Libyans were involved in both. And this would have been in the time frame of the Labelle disco bombing as well, which was Libyan backed. Libya was very active in the mid to late 80s with terrorist attacks. So Khartoum and Sana'a, Labelle disco bombing. And then in 87, we had a very serious threat against the Secretary of State and the president with an individual that drove to Washington, D.C. with a carload of firearms for the purposes of carrying out an attack. And fortunately, we were able to work that case. A very, very observant D.C. cop found the shooter at this flea bag motel in Anacostia. And the D.C. SWAT team arrested him that morning. And we started interviewing him about, how he put that plot together and how he had surveilled us. And that really kind of opened my eyes to this world of how bad guys conduct surveillance, because he had kind of stalked us, Jack, for a long period of time, and we never saw him.
Yeah.
And so that really made me start thinking about the attack cycle and how can we get in front of these kinds of threats, and what are we missing, because we're just racing around the world on different bombings and attacks. And so, commingled in here, we had hijackings, we had ongoing hostage takings in Beirut, Lebanon. If memory serves me right, the first hostage I debriefed was Father Martin Jinko, a Catholic priest that had a wonderful man, had been, kidnapped by Hezbollah. We did not know it was Hezbollah at the time. We suspected it was. Then we had the hospital administrator at the American University Beirut kidnapped, David Jacobson, and he was released. My old friend Charlie Glass was an ABC News correspondent. He was kidnapped, but he was able to escape, and he was a wonderful witness on helping us piece together how the tactics deployed. And then, of course, our ultimate goal, Jack, was to find Bill Buckley.
Yeah. When did he come on your radar? When did you first?
His case file was handed to me when I first got into the group. My boss handed me the Beirut embassy files and Bill Buckley's files and said, he's the reason we're looking for all the hostages in Lebanon. Study up on this. We're trying to find him. You're going to be a part of what was called at the time the Hostage Location Task Force, the HLTF. And we were actually housed at the CIA inside the Counterterrorism Center.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a small group of interagency participants, namely me, an FBI agent, and an agency officer. And then we would have DOD support from time to time, depending upon the hostage and the situation and the requirements needed and so forth. So Bill Buckley's file was with me from day one on the job.
No kidding. Wow. And so right before that, we had TW 847. We have Achille Laurel. Later, a couple of years into it, we have Pan Am 103. And you were involved with that as well, correct?
Correct. We had the hijacking of Kuwaiti Air 422. We had the hijacking of Pan Am 73. And then the horrific bombing of Pan Am 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland, where we lost our agents that were on the flight, December 21st, 1988. I'll never forget that day, which was horrible. One of the other things my office did at the time, Jack, was we ran the Rewards for Justice program, which at the time was only $2 million. It subsequently ramped up to $20 million for bin Laden, right? Mm-hmm. But at the time, we had a $2 million bounty for the successful resolution, the favorable resolution of the identification of threat actors, or trying to stop threats that were unfolding. I remember, for example, what we wanted to do with Pan Am 103 is we wanted to use the $2 million bounty to lead us to the capture of those individuals that were responsible for that bombing, which at the time, forensically, we had tied to the Libyans. But we never were successful in getting our hands on anybody. The largest reward we paid under my watch, Jack, was to the informant that set up Ramzi Yousef, the mastermind of the first World Trade Center bombing.
Yeah.
So we paid that guy $1.2 million and put him inside of the witness security program.
Okay.
So our office.
That's amazing. So how did you get involved with that one? Because that one is bombing World Trade Center. He escapes and is in the Philippines, hatching another plot to bomb multiple airliners in the Pacific region on or around January, February timeframe of 95, I want to say. So,
right.
94, he's in the Philippines, tests a bomb, a successful bomb, didn't bring the aircraft down, but killed, I think, one person, and then used that as a test run for Operation Bojinka, I think they called it. And then there's a fire in the apartment, one of those, whether it was random or somebody they're doing something, who knows? But suspicious fire department shows up in Manila, and I think it was Manila, and hey, there's something suspicious here. Some guy runs off, and then that really led to the unraveling of that plot. But he still made it from there to Pakistan.
He did,
and that's where you tracked him down.
Right. The backstory was, when the World Trade Center was bombed the first time in '93, we obviously utilized the Rewards for Justice program to try to apprehend those who were responsible for that. And my office actually deployed agents to the bombing scene. A good friend of mine, Scotty Stewart, went up with our portable Aegis explosive detector device and drove that up to New York to work the crime scene. Our New York field office was involved. Obviously the FBI was responsible for the overall crime scene investigation, but it was a multi-agency effort with ATF, FBI, NYPD. Our office was engaged. Our New York field office was heavily involved. And so when the fire happened in Manila, the U.S. Embassy regional security officer at the time, which is, overseas in the State Department, special agents are the regional security officers or an assistant regional security officer. And he cabled in what had happened. And of course, we offered our help to the Philippine National Police. And if memory serves me right, they did take advantage of that. We offered our forensic and investigative assistance, and we eventually got our hands on, some of the laptops and some of the data at the time. And, that fire was set. I believe that he was cooking explosives and set the apartment on fire, if memory serves me right. It's been a while now. And then he fled from there, and he went around and then ultimately wound up in Pakistan. So during this time period, we were getting sightings of Yousef all over the world. And I had, by, sheer last man standing, I had somehow managed to become the deputy chief of our unit. And it certainly was no great feat on my part. I just think I had been there longer than anybody else, and nobody else wanted the damn job, right?
It's possible. No.
Yeah, nobody else wanted the job, and nobody else wanted to write employee performance reviews. So I was pretty good at that. Anyway, so Yousef, we have him all over the place, and we had all kinds of fraud, just information peddlers. Everybody's trying to get their hands on the reward monies for Yousef. And I got a call on the secure voice phone one day when I'm in the office. And we called it the bat phone, right?
Nice.
And I pick it up, and it was the regional security officer in Islamabad. And he was a great guy I'd known. I had worked a previous case with him. And so I knew he was a damn good investigator. And he goes, Fred, we've had a walk-in here. And he's not really a walk-in, but I don't want to get into details right now. But I think this informant is good. And so I kind of leaned back, was like, yeah, okay. Well, you're about the 20th person to call me this week with a good informant. And he goes, no, no BS. I think this guy's pretty good. And I said, okay, I believe you. And literally, to make a long story short, I cover this in Ghost. The informant had befriended Yousef and got nervous, Jack, because he was being used as a courier run, as a dummy run, to carry these little baby dolls onto planes. And Yousef's intentions, back to the Bojinka plot, was to take these baby doll bombs and fan them out on different flights and blow up several different airliners. And so our informant had carried one of these devices, and on his last trial run, the light bulb went off in his head saying, I may not come off on the next plane that I'm on.
Right. Here's another trial run for you. And yet it's not the trial run.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of like, I'm sure with, the teams for you guys, who wants to volunteer?
Voluntold is more like how it works there.
Yeah, exactly. So he,
did they ever make it through with those actual explosives in there, or was it just the shell, like making it
just
through?
the shell, Jack.
Yeah.
Provided the guy was telling us the truth,
right.
Which I believe him. He turned out to be a solid informant that gave us Yousef, and he had said to our agents that initially debriefed him that he had seen a Rewards for Justice poster, and he said, "I know this. I know this guy. He's going to contact me," and that led to kind of the unraveling. And so when our agents called me, I said, "Well, okay, tell him to call us when Yousef shows back up." And lo and behold, Yousef showed back up. I think it was within a 36-hour window. And, the rest is kind of history.
Incredible. When that happened, I was traveling in Australia, New Zealand in that December, January timeframe. And I remember I think it was flying out of New Zealand, went to Australia, but flying out of New Zealand. But regardless, I'd never seen security switch like that. Like as I'm there, I see everything start to change, and I see lines not just forming through the regular security, but once you got to the gate, all your bags checked, your shoes off, everyone individually checked before they went and got on the plane. And the whole atmosphere had changed in that airport while I was waiting there. I think it was early January of 95, I think. But you could see it because it was one of those routes that may have been targeted. So heading home from Australia, from New Zealand during that time frame. But it was interesting to see security change. I'd never seen that before. And then later, I find out, what it was, why they were doing that. Yeah, crazy. But you're involved in all these things. And now Ramzi Yousef is serving a lot of time at the Supermax prison in Colorado.
Yeah. Jack, I've gotten way, way too much credit for that. My role was, I did what any of us would have done during that time frame to capture this guy. One of the things that still drives me crazy, Jack, is I know he was in Islamabad to carry out some sort of attack, and for the life of me, we never could figure out what he was up to. And so, my gut told me at the time that, you have to step back and look at this time period. I mean, he had already blown up the World Trade Center the first time. He had planned to kill the Pope in the Philippines. He had planted bombs on airplanes coming out of the South Pacific. Yeah. And now he's in Islamabad, and he was walking around the diplomatic enclave with our informant, looking for homes. And I think he was very much trying to plan an attack to go after a Western diplomat of some kind, probably with some sort of bomb, but I don't know. And that was one of those kinds of things that there's so many of these cases, Jack, that just haunt me because, the target that was hit, but you don't really know all the other targets that were looked at to get to that point.
Right. Right. He certainly wasn't there on vacation or just to retire. I mean, he was a very active person.
Right. And, during that time period, the geopolitics of Pakistan were such that, we were dealing with, in many ways, the ISI, which was a hostile intelligence agency, where their loyalties lied at any given time, was almost trying to work with the KGB,
right?
When you started to, get down to it. And so it was just, there was really no rules with these folks.
Wow. That's amazing. And where did Carlos the Jackal fit into all this? He's on your your desk from day one.
Yeah, that's a fascinating story, Jack, because, in my generation, when I started, he was the poster child of terror.
Right. And I have a book over there called The New Jackals from back in the mid-90s, maybe late 90s, I forget. But I have a whole section here of books that I've collected over time, some of these older books on terrorism from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. But yeah, The New Jackals is in there and it has that title for a reason.
Yeah, he was literally the poster child. And I remember as a cop reading about Carlos the Jackal. He was this guy that was all around the world carrying out these terrorist attacks. He had done the OPEC summit. He had assassinated a Jewish businessman in London. He was a paid hitman, and he was working for Gaddafi. He was swimming in all these leftist radical circles with the old Italian Red Brigades, the Red Army faction, the Japanese Red Army, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine General Command, and he was living and moving with all these circles. So he was kind of like the poster child for somebody that you could never catch.
Right.
And I would sit there in my office and think, my goodness, we have Interpol, we have the CIA, we have U.S. Special Forces, we have MI6, we have everybody looking for this guy. Why can't we find him? And he was, being utilized as a nation state gun for hire. So he was traveling under pseudonyms and aliases on diplomatic passports. And so it's kind of an interesting kind of bookend to your question, because if you fast forward many, many years later to after Chasing Shadows came out, I get a call in my office one day, many years after I've left the government, from the FBI in Paris. And they said, hey, we saw your book and we want to reopen this case. And they said, well, who would you interview if you were us? And I said, I would try to get to Carlos the Jackal, because I could never get to him to talk to him directly. As a sidebar, Jack, I had been corresponding with his first wife, Magdalena Kopp, who had been a terrorist herself. And she was very helpful. It was amazing to me, and still is, the people that will answer my emails. But
That's incredible.
She had been corresponding with me and talking to me about Carlos, and I was asking her questions about the Alon murder, back in the 70s. And she said, well, if anybody would know, Carlos would know. So I pointed the FBI in that direction, and they did some follow-up interviews with Carlos, and I signed a bunch of books for them, and I actually shipped them off to the FBI, and they gave one to Carlos.
No way. That's incredible.
I don't think he liked it, but
that is too cool.
That's my Carlos story.
Oh my! And where is he locked up right now?
He's in a French prison for life for killing French police officers.
Jeez, that's incredible. And then when did you? What was your last case, or what did you? When did you leave the diplomatic security service?
Well, my last case, the last big case I remember, I was in Atlanta. I was running protective intelligence operations for the State Department for the protection of all the Olympic athletes in Atlanta at the Olympics, and I think that was in '96, right?
Yep.
And everything was fine until we had the bombing at Centennial Park. So one of the things that my office did, we were doing the Rewards for Justice program. That was a separate unit, now reporting to me. We were doing counterterrorism investigations, another separate unit. And we were doing protective intelligence, running intel for high threat protective details or large special events. So whenever we would have Yasser Arafat visit, or Princess Diana, or the British Royals, or any high threat protective operation, or a Middle East peace conference, or in this case, the Olympics in Atlanta, I was down there for 3 months for that. And so, of course, we had agents assigned to the FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force at the time. And, the bomb went off that night, and we had no idea, who did it. So, at that point in time, Jack, in my career, I was involved with, kind of managing, large scale operations and investigations. And, I left in 99 or 2000 now, if memory serves me right. And I think the last big case was probably, the bombing in Atlanta, or, the aftermath of the Yousef roundup and threats. I'm I'm trying to remember any others that transpired in that time period off the top of my head, and I just can't right now.
Yeah, no, amazing. What a formative time that time from 1979 really to 2001. And then we had that paradigm shift with terrorism in 2001, of course. But that period from 79 to 2001, what a fascinating time. That's, where I grew up, where I was seeing Walter Cronkite count down the days that we have U.S. citizens as hostages in Iran. I remember Desert One. I remember the Beirut Marine Barracks bombing. I remember on Newsweek, on Time Magazine, on the newspaper, and I was always just drawn to those things. I knew where I was headed. I knew the path I was on. I remember the picture of TWA 847. Of course, I remember 103 because I'm a little older by that point. But all those things were very impactful to me. I can't think of anything that was as impactful as seeing those headlines, reading those articles, and knowing that somehow, as I moved into special operations, that this would be my enemy of the future. So what an amazing time to be intimately involved with those cases and those people and those personalities, essentially figuring it out as you're going along, because you're starting something from scratch, really. I mean, you can't look back to, hey, what did we do? What did this office do in 1950 about these things? No. What do we do in 55? What do we do in 60? No, you're figuring this out as you're going during that seminal 20-year period, I'd say, between 79 and 2001. So, and then you get out and you go right into Strat 4, or what do you do from there?
Yeah, I got out and I went into the private sector, working, taking my protective intelligence model that, on how to protect corporate executives. And, Strat 4 gave me a home, which I'm extraordinarily grateful for, because it gave me a platform and the ability to research and write books, which, I tell people this all the time, Jack. I could not have imagined, as a 17-year-old rescue squad volunteer, to a police officer, to being an agent, to writing books today. And my life has been very blessed to have been able to do some of the things that I've done, and I'm extraordinarily grateful for those experiences over my lifetime, because I do sincerely believe that I had the opportunity to, stand on the shoulders of giants before me that kind of helped me along the way. I mean, I remember, vividly, my first boss in the counterterrorism unit saying, I remember looking at a flash cable of a hijacking, which might have been the Kuwaiti Air Flight 422, and him looking at me saying, well, what are you going to do about it? And it's like, well, I don't really know what to do about it, but I know we need to go. So, we would just get on a plane and go and, try to figure out what happened. And so, there were so many of those kinds of cases, but we literally in those days, Jack, were kind of making it up on the fly.
Yeah.
It's hard to believe, and some of your listeners and viewers may not believe this, but I can remember one time calling the FBI and saying, hey, I've got evidence from this terrorist attack overseas. I need somebody to process it for me. I had gone over and investigated. This was a bombing in Madrid,
Okay.
a Japanese Red Army rocket attack against the U.S. Embassy there. And I came back with some evidence, and they said, well, we don't really know if we're interested in that. So I remember calling ATF and saying, hey, I've got this evidence from this bombing. Do you think you can help me out here? Can you make sense of what it is? And it was just such a different time period in our war on terror. And quite frankly, Jack, I don't think we were very successful at all. We did the best we could, but there was just not a national focus, and we just didn't have the resources. And, that all changed on 2001.
Mm-hmm.
But before 2001, we were literally kind of making up the rules on our own and doing the best we could.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing this story. So in these books right here, so Beirut Rules, for those who have not read this, I mean, it's not just, all these books are not just for security professionals. One, they're great. You could read them almost as fiction, and have a great reading experience, but they're nonfiction. And I keep going back to Beirut Rules, of course, because a lot of my my characters have some sort of connection, or when I'm trying to get a feel for the Middle East during this time period, I just keep going back to this and try to get inside of the heads of some of the terrorists back there, what they were thinking, how they planned, all those sorts of things. And so Beirut Rules, I love this book. Go back to it time and time again. It's very well gone through here, and I have yellow stickies in here to mark certain things. So incredible. What I want to do is have you back on throughout the year and talk about each one of these individually, because each one of these is a podcast here. Chasing Shadows is the one we just talked about, and I love this, going back to your backstory and growing up and having that impactful, killing in your neighborhood that sent you on the path. And then Benghazi, of course. So I knew Ty Woods and Glenn Doherty.
Heroes.
So I knew those
Heroes,
guys.
Jack.
My first, Ty was at my first SEAL team, and then Glenn and I went through training together through SEAL qualification training. So yeah, this is incredible. Under Fire, right here. You guys do an amazing job. You and Sam Katz, and then Ghost. And this thing, this is amazing. This reads like a thriller, like a Jean Le Carré novel almost in this. But do you still carry a card with you with names on it?
You're going to think I'm paranoid, Jack, but I had to put it in a safe deposit box. I got kind of worried when people kept asking me questions about like my moleskin notebooks, and I have it in a safety deposit box.
Good. Was it always the same card, or did you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so for those listening, it was the names of people that had not yet been brought to justice. Is that right?
That's correct.
And
yeah.
Just as a reminder, having that close to you, and even afterward, when you heard that someone was brought to justice, you'd cross that name off the list.
Correct.
Right? Amazing.
Correct.
Incredible. So yeah, these books, thank you so much for writing them and sharing this story with the rest of us. It's an invaluable resource for me, and they're so well researched, so well written. So can't recommend these enough to everybody. So, but let's do it again, and let's come back and let's talk about each one of these individually, because they deserve their own time slot.
Well, you're very kind, Jack, and I must say before we sign off here that The Devil's Hand was awesome. And I am fortunate enough to have read that book. Thank you for sending that to me ahead of time.
Absolutely.
You kept me up for 2 nights. I finished it in 2 days. So I hope that you're working on your next one, because now you're leaving me hanging.
I am working on the next one. Book 5 is in the works right now, and I already know where book 6 goes. So I'm very excited to be doing that. And speaking of projects, we don't have to talk about it right now, but I can tease maybe that you have another project in the works that I really hope that you allocate resources into, because I think it's a fascinating topic to explore, and something that people don't know that much about, but need to be reminded of. And these keep the memories alive of a lot of these people who sacrificed themselves for our country. So, so I don't know if you don't have to tease it, because I don't know what stage it's in, but I know you have something else that's on your mind that you might be working on here pretty soon, and I hope you do.
I do, Jack. I'm going back to again a cold case that I'm shining a spotlight on from 1979, and telling a story that truly needs to be told. So that's about all I can say at this juncture.
I hear ya.
But stay tuned.
I will. And where can people find you these days? What are you doing these days? You've moved on from Stratfor, and what are you up to?
I'm currently the executive director of the Ontic Center for Protective Intelligence, which is located in Austin, Texas. And you can find me at officialfredburton.com, or you can find me on our Ontic website. And so it's a nice bookend for my career at this stage of my life, with something that I was heavily engaged with starting back in the 80s, Jack. So, but I'd love to hear from your listeners, and I thank you for everything that you have done, not only to me and for me, but also for our great nation, Jack.
Well, thank you so much. Sincerely appreciate your friendship, and yeah, it means the world to me. And you're also on Twitter and Instagram at official Fred Burton on those, I think.
Correct. On Twitter, I'm at Fred_Burton or something like that. I not really. I can never get it right, but I'm on Instagram as well. So I don't think there's too many Fred Burtons out there. There's not too many Freds left.
And they can link from the website there. So
Absolutely.
amazing. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. I sincerely appreciate you taking time out of your day to sit and talk. And hopefully, I'll get down there to Austin, and we'll hang out in person as the world hopefully gets us to a place where we can travel a little easier, and hopefully we can do that soon.
Anytime, Jack.
Welcome to the Spotlight section of the Danger Close podcast. So this is not a Model 19, like I just talked about with Fred Burton on the podcast. This is a titanium Smith & Wesson 38. But I bring it up because when Fred started both in the police department in Maryland and then with the Diplomatic Security Service, he carried a wheel gun, a revolver. So as a student of weaponcraft, I think it's important that we know not just how to use the modern striker fire type pistols, but know how to run these revolvers as well. And it's also super fun. So heading up to Thunder Ranch to do their revolver course is something that I highly recommend. And I love running a revolver with Clint Smith yelling at me as I move through different courses of fire. So once again, a student of weapons, revolvers are a necessity to know how to use and run. So bam. Also, Fred Burton, at the end, we talked about a list that he used to carry around in what was for him a black moleskin notebook. And he would write the names down of different people, whether they were trigger pullers as assassins, whether they're bomb makers, whether they were the watchers, the close target reconnaissance people, as part of different terrorist operations that he would then investigate. And those people that got away, he would write their names down in a book that he would carry with him all the time. So I always think it's good to have a solid leather notebook and a special pen for which to keep track of whatever you're keeping track of. And in Fred's case, it was assassins and terrorists. And even after he got out, he would cross those names out when people in the CIA, the FBI, Diplomatic Security Service brought these terrorists to justice. So that's it. Revolvers and notebooks. Thank you for joining me on the Danger Close podcast, an Ironclad original presented by Sig Sauer. And be sure and visit officialfredburton.com, pick up his books, and tell friends about them. And if you enjoyed the podcast, please leave a review, subscribe, leave a rating, do all those things, and we'll keep bringing these to you every Wednesday. So until then, stay strong and keep fighting.